Welcome to the Boswell Book Company virtual event series. I'm Daniel from Boswell. It is day 4,605 of us being in business, and I'd like to introduce Lydia Kang and Nate Pedersen, the authors of Patient Zero, A Curious History of the World's Worst Diseases. The book has been winning raves from critics and readers alike, including this from Publishers Weekly. Kang and Pedersen's conversational tone keeps things moving, and they're magnificent at reminding readers that although pathogens will continue to consume ravenously, kill what's in their way, and adapt, medicine has come a long way from recommending blood baths, drinking urine, and consuming mercury as treatment. Readers will be swept away by this energetic and enlightening survey. Lydia Kang is a practicing internal medicine physician and author of YA novels, including Control, Catalyst, and the upcoming November Girl, plus A Beautiful Poison, her debut novel for adults. Her nonfiction has been published in JAMA, the Annals of Internal Medicine, and the Journal of General Internal Medicine. Nate Pedersen is a librarian, historian, and freelance journalist with over 400 publications in print and online, including The Guardian, The Believer, and what was that? And the San Francisco Chronicle, you say. And together they are the authors of Quackery, A Brief History of the Worst Ways to Cure Everything. Welcome virtually to Milwaukee, or in some cases back to Wisconsin, but this time virtually. We're so glad to have you here. I just want to let folks know, you can ask questions in the chat or the Q&A. I'll be back to help field them, but right now we've got a conversation with our two authors.
Hi, everybody. So thank you guys all for coming. Daniel, thank you so much for having us, and thank you to Boswell Books. They actually do have our books in stock, even though technically our book isn't out until next Tuesday. And we also sent them a bunch of signed book plates, so you can actually get signed books with our signatures at the bookstore. So just really glad that you guys are all here supporting your local independent bookstore. And I'm actually hailing from Omaha, Nebraska right now. Nate, I actually don't know where you are right now.
I'm currently in Portland, Oregon, where I've been living for the last bit of time, but I have Wisconsin connections, so I'm excited to be here tonight. I have some friends and family from Wisconsin that I think are in attendance, and I'm a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And yeah, excited to be here virtually anyway, and chatting with everyone tonight. So yeah, Lydia, maybe we should start by talking a little bit. One of the questions that comes up a lot for me is about writing this book in the midst of a pandemic, and I always like telling the story about how we sold the book before this was even a thing. So maybe we should start there.
Yeah, that was really weird, because I think that there was a little tiny notation in like a New York Times article in the spring of 2020 about how like, oh, everybody's jumping on the bandwagon and everybody's going to be publishing these books on COVID, and our book was mentioned. But the funny thing was that we had no intention of writing a pandemic book because there was a pandemic. We had come up with the idea in like the fall of 2019. So it was well before COVID had showed up in Wuhan, China, and we were just still hashing out like what we were going to write about. There wasn't even a COVID chapter. We weren't even thinking about that. And then I think it was very early January, I saw like an article, and I mentioned it to Nate, and I'm like, hey, there's this little outbreak in China. Maybe it'll end up in the book, maybe not. And we totally laughed it off. Like, do you remember me? I can't remember if I texted it to you, if it was in an email or something.
Yeah, I remember you chatting with me over email about it, just this kind of random story showing up in China about this viral outbreak, and then look what happened, you know?
Yeah, like never in our wildest dreams did we think that it was going to turn into something. We really thought it was going to be like, there will be a small outbreak, it'll be contained. And I was thinking, you know, if they do a really good job of finding out what the virus is and containing it, like that might be a really great story about how in our modern day, we track down new viruses or new outbreaks and figure out what they are and how to stop them. So I was like, oh, you know, maybe that would be nice, but like it has yet to be stopped. It is still going. And we actually thought this book was going to come out after the pandemic had ended. So that sort of speaks to how well we are as soothsayers, like at least from 2 years ago, that yeah, it kind of changed quite a bit. So
Yeah, it was a very surreal experience, of course, writing this book while living through a pandemic, right? And that's just always going to be a vivid memory coming home. So in my day job is to work in a public library, and we stayed open during the entirety really of the pandemic. So, you'd show up for work every day and be constantly shifting protocols in line with what the current safety guidance was, and then coming home at night and writing all about, infectious diseases of the past. So we were both really immersed in that world for a really long time. And anyway, we, like to Lydia's point, we certainly thought by now we'd have cleared this hurdle, and yet here we are.
Yeah. And, it's funny because when we were writing it, we would just come upon these like passages or these moments in time in the past that were just very eerily reminiscent of what was happening like right now. And so that would come up here and there. And I think obviously, actually the first chapter that I wrote was on the plague. So it was on the bubonic plague. And we, when I was writing it, it was actually right around the time that, there was starting to be this sort of anti-Chinese sentiment, like the Chinese virus thing happened. And there was a lot of similarities with the outbreak of the plague in San Francisco around 1900, where people originally were like, I don't even believe that there's a true outbreak happening. We think it's all fake. So that happened. And I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then there was a whole like, well, we're gonna blame like Chinese Americans and people in Chinatown for the plague. And so that was kind of, I was like, all right, this is also kind of repeating history here. And it eventually was, under control, and it wasn't that bad. But like I remember writing that being like, oh, why is history repeating itself? And that happened also when I was writing the part in the 1918 influenza pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu, because there was a ton of anti-mask sentiment at the time. Like a lot of people were they hated masking, they didn't like it at all. And so I thought, God, some things really never changed at all. Nate, did you like come across anything when you were writing that you thought was just particularly just strange or apropos when you were doing your research? Do you remember?
Well, I think, it's interesting because as you think about, I guess maybe one of the things about being immersed in the history of infectious disease and pandemics throughout time is you also sort of realize how, I mean, and I don't mean to downplay COVID, right? But at the same time, like there's way worse viral outbreaks that have happened throughout history. And I think that was part that was always kind of interesting to me, the interplay between researching stuff with like way worse mortality rates, right?
Mm-hmm.
While also kind of watching the panic that developed over a disease with a comparatively not a very high mortality rate, and it's just interesting how that, the fact that we culturally, globally, I guess, that we across the entire world were going through this thing together, and everyone was sort of, this is kind of the first major global pandemic of our time, right? And it's just interesting to me, thinking about how much worse things could have been or might be in the future, how this could easily be like this trial run for something else similar to some of these outbreaks in the past that were more easily contained just by virtue of lack of mass transportation that you see today, like global connectedness through air travel, et cetera, thus diseases couldn't spread as quickly. And so it's just kind of scary to think of too, right? Like how difficult, as we all saw, how difficult it is to contain a very contagious disease with a mortality rate, but again, nothing like what you see in some other cases, and just what could potentially happen. Not to be a doomsayer, but to me that was always kind of interesting too.
Yeah, and I think that I think I kept watching what was happening with the pandemic and the variants and wondering if, this virus was going to switch into something that was going to be either more deadly, more transmissible. Okay, it did end up being more transmissible with a Delta variant. So watching that happen was a bit of a shock. But you're right. Like there were so many things that we looked at, like, just look at the plague and how it killed off maybe 30 to 50 million people
Yeah.
which is like a gigantic chunk of the actual world's population. And I was like, okay, this isn't that bad, but it's still really bad. What was, sorry, slight switch in conversation, but like, so the plague chapter was the first one that I wrote. Nate and I split all the chapters up. So people ask us all the time how we go about writing our stuff, and we actually write chapters separately. So we like divvy the book up. We sort of pick our chapters and then we sort of just go for it. Nate, what was your first chapter? Was it typhus?
Typhus. Yeah.
It was
my
typhus.
chapter was typhus. So that's a
Yeah.
bacterial disease. If you're not familiar with typhus, that's spread through basically through fleas or lice, or if they're on your body and they produce feces like other living creatures. And if that feces is rubbed into any kind of like open wound, then perhaps a wound made by, by the body louse itself, then you become infected with typhus. So, and that used to be a huge problem in like places where it would get pretty cold in the winter and where people were living in kind of unsanitary conditions. And that was a really interesting disease just to track a bit through history, because multiple times typhus outbreaks have sort of like dramatically altered the course of history, which is pretty interesting because it would follow around armies, armies on the march in cold weather and with unsanitary conditions would become these sort of little havens for typhus to really flourish.
Yeah.
And a really good example of that, which I thought was interesting to research, was when Napoleon tried to invade Russia, which is like this catastrophic military mistake on almost every possible angle, for time.
I'm actually moving just so that I can illustrate this for you, because I actually have this on my wall.
What is this?
You see that? So
oh my gosh,
this is Edward Puffy's Napoleon's March to Moscow that we have on the wall because it's pretty, but it tells a lot of information. And you can see basically like the width of this brown bar is like the number of soldiers. And you can see that as they get closer and closer to Moscow, the number of soldiers decreases and decreases. And then this is their march back. And then you can see at the very end, they end up with 10,000 soldiers, but they started out with 422. And part of that was because of
typhus.
Yeah,
Russian didn't do them any favors there either, and they made a few other military blunders, but a lot of those people died because of mass typhus outbreaks that kept on happening over and over again throughout that harsh winter. So one of the greatest military defeats of all time, and Western European history is significantly altered as a result of the failed invasion of Russia. It's just interesting to see the interplay of disease with historical events.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when you wrote that part, I got really excited because I could look at my Tufty picture and learn all about it. And it's funny how writing this, like, so Nate, is a historian and a librarian. So this is kind of stuff that he tackles. I was never particularly a huge fan of history until I think like after graduate school, after medical school. I just was not really much of a history buff when I was in high school and stuff like that. But I used to always pick things from stories that I would find really interesting, and they would just really stick out in my brain. And so I was telling Nate, I was like, I remember reading All Quiet on the Western Front when I was in high school. And I don't remember anything from history class, but I remember them pulling the body lice off of themselves and frying them in a pan and killing the lice because they were, just ridden with vermin. And we actually ended up putting that quote in that chapter because of, thank you very much, my English teacher from high school, for making me read that, because it was a fantastic book. But it was that's a really gross passage. You guys should probably, should I read it? I have it right in front of me.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So this is from Erich Maria Remarque's classic novel, World War I, All Quiet on the Western Front. Quote, killing each separate louse is a tedious business when a man has hundreds. The little beasts are hard, and the everlasting cracking with one's fingernails very soon becomes wearisome. So Chadin had rigged up a lid of a boot polish tin with a piece of wire over the lighted stump of a candle. the lice are simply thrown into this little pan, crack, and they're done for. I'm sorry if you are eating dinner right now. We may be apologizing multiple times tonight because we write about a lot of things that are a little gross, because disease can get a little juicy sometimes, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's a really vivid description, and would have been such a common experience for thousands of soldiers on all fronts in the European theater during the war. Which is just I think it's just a really vividly put spot. I'm not surprised it stuck in your head.
Yeah.
High school.
Yeah, there were a bunch of things that that I had read that ended up in the book, and they were all related to infectious diseases. So like, let's see. Oh, Jane Eyre, which is one of my favorite books of all time. So early on in the book, when she's at that Lowood Academy it's like this orphanage / school, typhus actually comes through and kills off like a huge chunk of the students. But they talk about how like people in the community found out that all these little girls were dying, and they looked at the school, and they found out that it was the school was right near this like really boggy, wet area, and they said they were saying that it was fog-bred pestilence that was rising up out of this sort of dirty, muggy, wet area that had caused the typhus outbreak. So we know obviously that typhus is from this bacteria that comes from these body lice and stuff like that, but they were talking about this theory called miasma, which is that these sort of like bad vapors from sometimes rotting garbage or just like foggy bottomed swampy areas could rise up and cause all sorts of infection. And so that ended up leading to us writing the chapter on germ theory, which was how it actually finally came to be that we discovered that germs existed and everything like that. So once again, it was just me with my head stuck in a book when I was a kid, that all this stuff ends up in here.
Well, and that's not the only Bronte sister that shows up in the book either. So Jane Eyre, written by Charlotte Bronte, her sister Emily Bronte wrote another classic novel, Wuthering Heights. And the way she intersects with our book is in the rabies chapter, which is rabies, and we can maybe talk about this later, but maybe you could talk about your favorite virus too, Lydia, but rabies is my favorite virus in a way that we covered.
It's pretty cool.
Rabies, and just from an evolutionary perspective, it's an enormously impressive virus. And before there was a vaccine for it, it had literally like 100% mortality rate. If you got rabies, it was a death sentence, which is pretty crazy. So there was very limited options available to you if you were bit by a rabid dog or suspected you might have been, which happened to Emily Bronte when she was very young. When she was a young girl growing up in a remote part of the moors of northern England. And one day she's walking home from school and she's bitten by a dog. She tries to pet a stray dog and the dog bites her. And I just think this is such a brave thing to do, isn't it? She walks home. She doesn't tell her father. She doesn't tell her sisters. She just walks straight to the roaring fire, the roaring fire to keep away the cold, and grabs a poker, heats it up in the fire, and then just uses that to burn her own wound. So she's cauterizing her wound, which was about the best you could do, because the hope is that by cauterizing your wound, you could potentially, kill the virus that might have been raging inside of it from the bite from a rabid dog. And then she just didn't say anything and let 2 weeks go by, which is about the amount of time before if you officially got rabies or not. So talk about like what is scary for a little girl in particular, right? Like what a scary thing to live through. And stoically she endured that and didn't get rabies in the end, whether maybe the dog wasn't rabid or maybe the cautery worked, and went on to write Wuthering Heights. So there you go.
I know. And then she shows up again in the book. Like the Brontes are all over this book because first of all, they just write some really cool stuff, and they just actually went through a lot of stuff that many people did in that decade that they were alive and writing. So there were, I think several of them suffered from tuberculosis, and some of their characters also suffered from tuberculosis as well. Jane Eyre's best friend in school dies of tuberculosis in the story as well. So So that led to like an entire chapter on tuberculosis and how for quite some time people used to think that people suffering from tuberculosis were actually being victims of vampires, which is kind of interesting. So if you guys have probably all seen tuberculosis in a story, in a movie or something like that. Like, you know, there's always somebody who's sort of coughing into a handkerchief and it's all speckled with blood, or they're kind of getting thinner and thinner. There's like Doc Holliday and you know, the Brontes and what was that movie with oh my God, I'm totally forgetting what it was with like Nicole Kidman and she was also tragically dying of tuberculosis as well.
Moulin Rouge, right?
Yes, that's it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That one, yeah. And I remember after that happened, I immediately Googled, how do you actually die from tuberculosis? Because I was like, how did she, like, what was actually happening to her? Because tuberculosis not only just sort of like just it just takes so much of your energy, you kind of waste away and you get thinner and thinner, and thus the name consumption, which is its other name, it like kind of consumes you. But oftentimes if you have like the infections in your lungs, it will like kind of erode through into a large blood vessel and you're sort of like bleed out on the inside, or you can die from other infections that sort of come and get you. So, but it actually is a horrible disease. And right now about 1/3 of the entire world's population still has tuberculosis, which is stunning and shocking that there are all these diseases that have been around for centuries that you think that with modern medicine and, you know, all that kind of stuff, we would have a handle on it. But there is a huge division between how first world countries can handle some of these big pandemic epidemics and countries that aren't as wealthy can deal with them. But it was interesting when I was writing about tuberculosis and hearing about the whole vampire thing, it ended up becoming an idea for another book, so I'm going to do a tiny little plug. I have a book that's coming out in May with Lake Union, which is called, it's not this book. It's a book that came out last year. I can't keep them straight. Sorry. I write a lot of books. The book that came out last summer, which is called Opium and Absinthe. And it's about somebody who seemingly dies from a vampire bite. And the character actually ends up having to research why some people might think vampires exist. And she finds out that tuberculosis might be one of the possible causes of like these sort of fake vampire things. But yeah, I have been mining these books like Quackery and like Patient Zero for my novels, because they are a nonstop source of really fascinating, interesting bits of history that end up in historical fiction. So yeah, it's kind of one of the silver linings, the little sort of side gigs that I get to experience as a result of my research.
Are you in a spot, Lydia, to talk about your latest idea? I'm not sure if that one is public or not yet, that ties into one of the chapters in this book.
Oh, which one? Which
with
one?
The ergotism.
Oh, no, I'm not in a spot yet, but I will be. I have an idea for something else. I haven't pitched it yet to the publisher, so it's mum for now. That being said, the other book that I have coming out in May, which is called The Half-Life of Ruby Fielding, is about World War I, New York City, the Manhattan Project, and poisons. And I'm trying to think, yeah, during World War II, yeah, there were a couple of things in this book that end up sort of showing up in there as far as like other bits of historical information. But I'm not going to go into that anymore because I could go on with that like forever and ever. So yeah, so tuberculosis was one of those chapters. Like I had so much fun writing it. It seems really wrong to say I had fun writing about tuberculosis because a lot of these like diseases are really, really tough to read about. Like people really suffer, but the history behind them is kind of fascinating, and how they, just like Nate, you're saying, how they shape so much of history, the arts and culture was really eye-opening, because we knew some of it like going into it, and we learned so much more after we sort of finished writing it.
Looks like we got a question that came through the chat about quackery.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
So
Oh, thank you for the Edward Tufte link. That's pretty awesome. We're very big Tufte fans. We have like a couple of his stuff like framed around our house just because they're really cool. Oh, and thank you for putting my books up there. So yeah, so Quackery. Oh my gosh. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that happens because we get this question all the time because there are a lot of really fantastic science writers out there like Mary Roach and Brandy Shalais and lots of other people. And most of the time they're always writing there's a single person writing, and Nate and I are like a writing duo for these subjects. So I do get the question a lot about how it came to be that we actually have been writing these together. So Nate, do you want to tell them the story?
Oh, sure. Yeah, just the kind of the formation of this writing partnership. It
Yeah.
actually, we're connected through my wife, April DeHulke. So she's a novelist as well. And Lydia and her shared publisher. Their first young adult novels came out the same year, back in 2013, with Penguin. And so they were on a lot of the same publicity tours at the time. And I was fortunate enough to accompany April within a couple of her stops. And I think it was maybe 2014, 2015 at Comic-Con in San Diego, and April and Lydia and I were all hanging out having a lunch at a cafe on the waterfront, and found that we had a similar sense of humor and a similar sense of interest in morbid parts of history. So we, April, my wife April, said you two should try to write a book together, and that book became Quackery, and that's kind of how this whole thing started.
Yeah, sorry about that. I have to mute once in a while because the dogs are like chasing balls upstairs and they get really excited. So apologize for that. So yeah, when you emailed me and you were like, hey, why don't we write this book together? I remember thinking like, okay, I have the medical background to sort of to look into this stuff and kind of vet it, and it would be totally fun to write about. But I was mostly excited because, again, I was at a point in my life where I was finding history really, really interesting, which I hadn't before. And so I went to medical school, and in medical school for 4 years, you don't get any medical history. Like you hear about these names, everything's named after something, Laennec and this and that. And but you don't get the story about how that name ended up on, this liver disease or that sort of a thing. There's just no history there because there's no time. You're spending so much time crammed into trying to learn how to take care of people. And so I thought I get to do the sort of deep dive into history that I did not get to do in medical school because there wasn't time. So for very personal, somewhat selfish reasons, I was really excited to do Quackery because I felt like I could round out part of my medical education that I never got. So, and it continues on with Patient Zero because this was a whole other deep dive into another facet of medicine that I didn't get the history of.
And we did get to revisit Quackery a little bit in Patient Zero. So one of the chapters in Patient Zero breaks down some of our, I guess you could say, our favorite quack treatments for some of the diseases that we cover in the rest of the book. Mm-hmm. So we can talk a little bit about that too. I guess I'll mention the one for rabies because rabies has already come up for me.
Oh yeah, you want to read that one?
Sure. Yeah, I can read it. So these are just rather than the kind of the narrative chapters that most of the book occurs in. The Quackery section is more like this. These little breakout sections of little bits of info. If I can find it, I will read it. Otherwise, I might just tell you the story.
Well, there's one on page 209. There's the hair of the dog, and then there's also where's the other one?
So hair of the dog. From 1st century Italy, the Roman writer and naturalist Pliny the Elder describes rabies treatments in detail in his natural history. His most famous cure remains with us today is an expression to describe a hangover treatment, the hair of the dog. The origins of the phrase come from a rabies treatment, where Pliny suggested that one should insert in the wound ashes of hairs from the tail of the dog that inflicted the bite. He had several other suggestions as well, including inserting a maggot from the dead dog's corpse into the bite wound, or wrapping a wound with a linen cloth soaked with the menstrual blood of a female dog. Once someone decapitated the rabid dog, the other options started to present themselves. You could also burn the head and put the ashes in your wound, or if you were feeling peckish, you could just eat the dog's head.
Oh God.
A variety of options for you if you happen to get rabies.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my gosh. We there were so many things that we could have like probably done like a second quackery on all things sort of infectious disease related, but we had to kind of keep that as limited as possible because there's so much. But yeah, that was a really fun one, that whole chapter.
We have a question in the chat. What's the origin of the term patient zero?
Oh, that's a good one. There's a whole chapter on that too. So I didn't know this when we first decided to write the book. I think what happened was we were thinking of what we were going to do for the book. We were thinking we were going to do patient zero stories. So stories about people who were seemingly the beginning of an epidemic or a pandemic or an outbreak. And my initial gut feeling was, we have to be really careful because this book is going to sound like a finger pointing book, like, sort of laying blame on the person who, brought COVID over to the United States, or the person who's the reason why, measles outbreak happened, that sort of thing. And I knew it was really a lot more complicated, but when we first started to do the research for, are we even going to write this book? I started to look into the term itself, and it ended up actually being a humongous part of the chapter on the patient zero for HIV. So the story behind the term patient zero is that it was a mistake. So it's actually what happened was when HIV started to show up in the United States in the 1980s, and it was initially seemingly showing up in the gay population. They were thinking that they're trying to connect and do essentially contact tracing to find out, like, where is this outbreak coming from, and is there a commonality? And so this one paper got published where it was in 1984, and they had like a cluster of these people who had HIV, and they were connecting them sort of like almost on this visual map. So you have like this person and that person and that person, and they were all interconnected, but they were all clustering and connecting to a central figure. So there was one person who'd had a sexual relationship with multiple people. So it kind of looked like this sort of starburst pattern. And the person in the middle, they were all, anonymous in the paper. The person in the middle was designated with the letter O. And it was because most of the people in this cluster were in the sort of Los Angeles, San Francisco area, and the person in the middle was from outside of California. And so it had the O in it. So when the very, very popular book and the band Played On by Randy Shilts came out, Shilts was noticing that a lot of the doctors and scientists who were talking about what was going on and where the sources were referring to that person in the center as patient zero, even though it wasn't a zero, it was the letter O. And so that's how patient zero ended up becoming a popular term. It was if you think about it, it's also sort of very similar to this like ground zero phenomenon. It's like the point on the Earth's surface that's closest to the detonation of a nuclear bomb. And so it made sense to call it patient zero, like ground zero, but that's actually how it came to be. Interestingly, the person who was that designated O outside of California person was Gaetan Dugas, who was this Canadian flight attendant who did have a lot of sexual partners and was absolutely vilified for being the man. Actually, in the New York Post, there was an article right on the front, the man who gave us AIDS. So he was blamed for bringing HIV to the United States, when in fact he did not. It was actually not possible for him to have done that because the nature of HIV is it takes many, many years for symptoms of the immune deficiency or AIDS, as we call it, to manifest. And so he was not the origin, but he was blamed to be so. And it was all because of that one article that happened, that scientific article that happened in 1984. And so we use now patient zero for everything. Oh my gosh, like social, for cancel culture and for all different kinds of things. Patient zero has become this sort of ubiquitous cultural term for the person who was the first person to experience something or start something or that sort of thing. But that's where it began. Great question. Very, very great. It's almost like I asked you to ask that question, but yeah. So, yeah, that's that chapter. Honestly, was probably one of the most difficult chapters that I have ever written in this book, because it was so many different layers of what was happening in the 1980s. When did they think HIV actually hit the shores? Where do they think it came from before that? And there's a whole controversy about whether or not the source of HIV in North America was Haiti, which is a really, really complex and very fraught conversation. And then even going back farther, in Africa, what parts of Africa were, hit with HIV? What was the animal from which HIV actually spilled over? I don't know if you guys are even aware that HIV is what's considered a zoonosis, which is that it existed in primates, non-human primates, and then it made a jump to people, and not just once, probably more than once, because there's several different types of HIV. So that was just a very difficult chapter to write, to get so much of the information straight, and to deal with some really, really sensitive subjects. I'm like kind of curious, Nate. I don't know if I've ever actually asked you this question, but was there a chapter in the book that you found like particularly difficult to write?
Oh, well, the one I was thinking about, I don't know if I guess I'm not sure if I'd say it was particularly difficult to write, but just in terms of tying into this discussion around the concept of patient zero, is the converse of that, the anti-zero, like the last person to get a disease, right? And humankind eradicating a disease entirely is like astonishingly rare, like rarer than you might think, or at least for me before I started researching this book. And so maybe in a way it was hard to write a little bit about, like one of the last chapters in the book is about the last smallpox case, which is kind of this sort of epic tragedy that played out in 1978 in Birmingham, England, when a medical photographer that worked in a research lab that was studying smallpox. This is about 2 years after the WHO had declared the disease officially globally eradicated. She ended up catching it, and through a method that's still kind of debated today, how exactly that happened. But it led to and maybe some folks in the audience even remember that if you were around in the late 70s, it led to a big scare, about, oh my God, is smallpox out again at this point? And this woman died from it, rather tragically. And the part that I think is just so kind of scary in a way about that, right, is just how difficult it is to fully eradicate a disease, even with all these great advances in medical technology that we've all benefited from, over the last, especially the last 100 years. But, it's smallpox and I think rinderpest are like the only diseases officially eradicated. And polio was getting close, and that's another disease that lives large in people's memory. Anyone from the baby boomer generation, that was a part of your growing up, right? Like at that time, that was still before the polio vaccines had been developed. But that was an enormously successful effort, the attempt to eradicate polio for quite a long time until just recently, and again, sort of tragically, there's been some pretty substantial geopolitical difficulties with eradicating polio in unstable parts of the world, and the result is that it's the disease thus continues to flourish, continues to find ways to survive and mutate. So that's the kind of the other side of patient zero, the anti-zero, or what could potentially be the last person, just is an interesting concept to think about that gets the disease before we eradicate it. And hopefully that becomes increasingly common,
Yeah, absolutely. I think like I remember when I was writing the plague, I was also writing about how the plague is still around. So there were, I think, 7 cases of the plague in the United States in 2020. People are getting it sort of from animals in the Southwest, because that seems to be where it's kind of like living quietly. And it's like, so for all intents and purposes, like plague is kind of gone and dead. It's not bubbling up and causing problems. It's not, I don't even know if I would call it endemic in the United States, because it's just not at that level. Whereas like polio is like still endemic in like Afghanistan, and we still see, we don't think about it this way, but like the flu is an endemic virus. Like the flu is alive and well, and it still comes back every year. And cold viruses are endemic viruses. They're around also. But yeah, they are. It is shockingly difficult to actually completely eradicate an infection. What most of the time we're settling for is a certain like détente, right? Like we're living with it, and it doesn't kill us, but sometimes it gets to us, but we keep it at this low level of infection where we can still thrive and get around it, but it's still always there. And it's kind of haunting the way it sort of does that. And I think, the flu virus has been absolutely brilliant, the way it rapidly changes and manages to just keep coming back over and over again. And once in a while, like the flu does a little genetic dance with a new version from, a bird or a pig, and then we get swine flu, and we get a new pandemic because it's like this complete, like such a huge different antigenic shift from previous ones, and then we get pandemic, and then we get things like the 1918, so-called Spanish influenza. I mean, I've gotten that question a couple of times. They're like, do you think something that happened in 1918 could happen again? And I think the answer is, yeah, for sure. I think writing this book, Nate and I were like, yeah, we are not done, not by a long shot. Just going to keep happening over and over again. That's such a downer. We should probably end on something a little more positive, because it has been really fascinating and illuminating. So
really impressive, right, that we did manage to eradicate smallpox, because in terms of devastating diseases of the past, smallpox has got to rank up there as one of the worst ever, in human history, especially when it's introduced into a population that's had no previous exposure to it, which is what happened when Europeans first arrived in the Americas, and smallpox came with them. And no one even knows, but the death count is just extraordinary. It wiped out between perhaps 24 million and 95 million people. Which is just an astoundingly tragic death rate. And it advanced, of course. Smallpox can travel a lot faster than European soldiers and colonists in the 15th and 16th centuries, right? So as sort of that, as history played out, and Europeans continued to arrive in the Americas, both North and South. And as they advanced further into the interior, they'd find entire cities, villages completely empty, and would puzzle over it at the time. But what had been going on was that, smallpox was beating them to it. Smallpox is raging further ahead in the continent, and just wiping out entire civilizations, basically. It's just astounding to think of. But not to, and I know that just kind of brought us right back down again, but to bring us back,
not trying to be downer.
It's impressive that we have managed to eradicate a disease that at one point was that devastating and could take out 90 million people potentially. So that's impressive. So we should celebrate that.
We should. And it's funny, when you were writing that, I was like, I'm pretty sure I texted you a photo of I actually got a smallpox vaccine in 1979. So it was right after that last case that ever happened. They were still doing smallpox vaccines when you were traveling abroad to places that were more high risk. And so when I was in 1979, I was 8 years old. I went with my mom to South Korea to visit family, and I got a smallpox vaccine. And I remember them doing it. They put this little blue drop on my skin, and they use this little bifurcated fork. Kind of looks like this thing that you would use to spear an olive. And they pricked that little liquid into my skin, and it turned into this big black, that smaller than a dime, like this big, a scab that was super itchy. And they were like, don't pick at it. And of course I picked at it, and it turned into this little scar. So I have this tiny little scar, which I can't show you because I'm wearing the wrong sort of shirt, but I have this little scar here, it's just fascinating because, anybody who's had any vaccine whatsoever you have basically been touched by part of this really rich and frightening, but also miraculous in many ways, history of infectious diseases that have preceded us for, thousands and thousands of years. That vaccine that you're getting is a result of, a farmer and also a physician in the 1970s figuring out that these little pox on cows could maybe protect us from smallpox, and that's actually how it all started. So it's already 7:48. We need to leave a little bit of room for questions and answers, but my gosh, I think we covered a lot in this chat. Thank you guys all so much for coming. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you get a chance to read the book. There's so much more. Like, my book's all annotated, and because I've been rereading
special collectible edition with all the tabs on it.
I do, with all the tabs, all the interesting, fun, interesting things around here.
While we're waiting for questions, I'd love for you to talk about a little about, you both write in so many different areas. The camera went on, and we'd had still photos of you for our promotion. And then I looked and I was like, oh, I know her. We have met. And I sold books for you 7 years ago for Control.
Oh my God, did you really? Oh my God, that was a long time ago.
Yes, well, that's why I didn't immediately register. I'm like, oh yeah.
That's really funny. I know, it's just that the books are coming up in really weird places and people are starting to associate them with me. I actually was teaching a medical student last week, and we had finished 3 weeks of a rotation, and he was like, I just realized that you wrote Quackery. And I was like, yeah. And he was like, I read that when I started medical school, and now I'm doing a rotation with you, and I didn't put two and two together. Like, there you are. And I'm like, I'm everywhere. But yeah, so that's really cool. That's from way back when I was writing science fiction for young adults. Yep.
Well, it is kind of amazing. I'm always amazed by the doctor, the writing doctor, because really you're just not accomplishing enough being a doctor.
I don't think I could do this without Nate. Thank goodness Nate's a librarian and historian and can oh my God, can help me carry the load, because it is so much. There is so much to do, and it's so much easier to do it when you have a partnership. And Nate and I, it's so lucky, honestly, it's super lucky. We can mirror each other's voice when we write, and we can mirror each other's sense of humor. Like in Quackery is pretty funny. Sometimes I like to joke, we have the humor of a 14-year-old boy in that book. But we've been able to work really well together, and that was just sort of a super lucky thing. So yeah, so it's between the two of us, we've got librarian, historian, physician, journalist.
Are there people who say they can tell your chapters apart? Or because I couldn't really when I was reading, I didn't know.
No, but there have been people who told me that when they're reading Quackery, they can hear me as if I was reading it aloud to them, because they can hear my voice in it. Not necessarily which chapters, but I think because I do have a sense of humor, and I'm joking about stuff all the time, and I'm not terribly mature all the time. So,
well, that was an interesting contrast for us in terms of writing the two books. Because Quackery is a much lighter tone. If anyone in the audience has read that, there's a lot of jokes, and we're able to be pretty lighthearted throughout that book. And then this one, it was a lot more serious, and the tone reflects that as well. So it's just kind of a different tone as a result.
Yeah.
Have you brainstormed about, in terms of when you write another book together, would you prefer to have something where you can joke around more, or was it more revelatory to, there's sort of, you can feel like with this book perhaps that maybe it's more helpful to people. I don't know, maybe Quackery can be helpful too, to know what to think with a critical eye, I suppose. But have you thought about, and Nate, your subject matter is so broad. I assume Lydia could probably pull up just about anything, and you'd say, yeah, I know about that.
Well, that's the thing, if there's other librarians or historians in attendance, right? We probably all share that just general interest in research and a willingness to deep dive into anything and find what's interesting about it, right? And I think that serves you well when you're writing a book like this. So yeah, we do have, so I'm in the process of moving to Savannah, Georgia. I'm taking up a new position, managing the research library at Georgia Historical Society in Savannah. So that's delaying us making progress with our next idea, but we do have another one on the back burner, and I think by midwinter or so we should probably be getting pretty serious about that. I don't think we can, I guess, talk about it yet, but we do have something.
No, it's a secret. I understand.
Yeah, but it's one of the things that I think we've learned from writing about these different subject matters is that we ultimately want to write stuff that's just very readable and really interesting. We're both really curious people. And so we come up with these, we'll pull things out and we'll be like, oh my God, we got to write about this. We got to write about that. So I think the one thing that's sort of the common thread between the two of them is this sort of, this really huge feeling of curiosity of like, look at this really interesting thing. And how did this happen? And where's the beginning of it? And, you'll notice that there's a lot of etymology in both of the books. Like I'm always sort of like, why is vaccine called vaccine? It's from vacca, from cow, the Latin for cow, because it was from cowpox is sort of how the original vaccine sort of happened. So like that sort of stuff that, if you were one of those people who can go into Wikipedia looking up like one thing, and then an hour later, you're now looking up like toe fungus and you've no idea how you got there, like you will like this stuff because that's ultimately what we're doing is we're just constantly going on these like sort of investigative searches of like, how did this happen? And then that takes us a little on the left turn. And then we do these little sort of side chapters and little smaller bars on other interesting stuff. So it's all sort of about like picking at all those things that you kind of always wanted to know about, but then we get to actually look it up. So it's been so much fun.
Absolutely.
Can I ask if you had, go ahead, please, Nate.
Oh, I was agreeing with Lydia's statement. I just said absolutely. Go ahead, Daniel. Thank you.
I was just going to ask both of you if you felt that there was, the diseases are so different in some ways, but was there something like a through line in terms of lessons, some sort of lesson that you could pull out of your research that you would love for the world to understand better? Do you know what I mean?
Oh, the first thing that I would say would be that even though the book is called Patient Zero and it seems to be a story about like who caused what, the answer is really a lot more complex. I know that's not a satisfactory answer because people really want to be able to point a finger and say like, who's like, who's at fault for this? And the answer is no one in particular. It's nature. This is what nature does. And the other answer is it's us. It's like we are as a humanity, like as a species, we are causing a lot of this stuff to happen. And it's not terribly helpful to point and say like, well, that person was, eating food from like a wet market and like those people are doing this over there. We are a collective group of people who are all collectively doing a lot of unfortunate things to this planet. And that's what this happened. So that would be one of the things that would be one of my bottom line takeaways. Nate, do you have thoughts about what your big takeaway would be?
I think that's a really good one, Lydia. I think, and I guess just a recognition of the, like we're as a species, we're both very resilient and very fragile. Like in those two things in a weird way, or just you have to kind of keep both in your mind, I think, all the time. So, we're likely going to experience much worse pandemics again, of course, in the future, but we also have survived a lot throughout history and will likely continue to do so, so, there's that balance to me that I think is sort of a takeaway. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I wish you could talk to some, a lot of journalists and other folks who are obsessed with that, with the COVID, like who started it? Who's responsible? What's, people want, I guess people want answers, people want blame. It's got to be somebody's, it's always got to be somebody's fault. And I think the idea of saying it's all of our faults, because we all benefit from environmental, whatever you'd call it, devastation or intrusion or
Yeah.
or-
But all along the way, you know, it's we still manage to try to, like, you know, if COVID has shown us, if anything, that like we have this incredible ability to try to get on top of a pandemic faster and push out a vaccine really quickly, like way faster than we've ever done. Like so many, many huge strides have been made during this pandemic that we should be really, really proud of. And I want to mention, I think one thing just to end on, because I tweeted about this and I don't want to let the question go without answering. But I tweeted a little hook that said, I will answer the question about what brassieres have to do with the N95 mask. And I think it's just like a cute little way to end on, sort of like showing how ingenious people are. So here's the answer to the story. So here's the answer to the question. So in 1950, there was a woman named Sarah Little Turnbull who was working for House Beautiful, the magazine. She was one of the editors, and she was asked to help try to figure out how to make ribbons out of these melted polymers, like these little strands of plastic. And when she was doing that, she was working with 3M, you know, that's the company that makes Post-it notes. She thought, hey, you know, these would actually make really great padding, like for shoulder pads and bra pads and things like that. And then she had some family members who got really sick, and she was in and out of hospitals visiting. And towards the end of the 1950s, she thought maybe one of these could be turned into a mask. And so she helped 3M actually use some of these sort of woven polymers and help develop what ended up becoming the N95 mask. So early on in the pandemic, when you guys were all laughing at people who were making and jerry-rigging like their own masks out of bras, like at Walmart, like they actually were onto something.
It's all precedent, isn't it?
Absolutely. But I think it's like a fantastic little way to end on, like, hope. You know, we can do better as a species. We're always doing better. We're very ingenious, and hopefully when the next pandemic comes, we will manage to survive that one and do better.
We will find something else to do with our undergarments that we
Yeah. Well said.
Thank you both for a wonderful hour. We do have this event recorded. We'll send it out to everybody who signed up, and whether you came or not, we hope you'll be able to share it. The links, if you click on the link to purchase the book, either one of this book or maybe one of Lydia's other books, or and then when Nate has his book, I was going to ask you who your other, if you couldn't work with each other, who your dream collaborators will be. You can use that in another event. But in any case, those links will show up on another page, and you can save that when this event goes away. So the link for Quackery, that's our last thing we're going to do.
That would be great.
So, and in fact, oddly enough, I had it. I had the page up on our website because I had been planning to do that as well. So let me get that in here. And then I'm going to say thank you both. Congratulations on a wonderful book for its publication next week. And thank you all for coming. We wouldn't have a bookstore without you. Hope to see you at another event.
Thank you guys all for coming. Good night.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Daniel. We appreciate that. Thank you.